All right, warm welcome to this semi-plenary organized by our co-host, Netherlands Environmental Assessment Agency, PBL. Thanks for being a co-host. Thanks for contributing to this conference, and also thanks for this organizing this semi-plenary, which looks really awesome. The floor is yours, Marcel.
Thank you, Ingrid. Welcome everyone. Welcome also for the people online attending the session. My name is Marcel Kok. I'm a program leader, international biodiversity policy at PBL. And I guess many of you don't know what PBL is, but the PBL, Netherlands Environmental Assessment Agency, is a governmental agency in support of Dutch policy making on issues of nature, environment and spatial planning. The official mission is to help support the quality of decision making on these issues in the Netherlands. It's largely an institute that works on the domestic agenda, but also has a group of about 50 people working on international issues in support of Dutch international policies, as well as support of the international agendas of, for example, CBD and climate. So we're very happy to organize this session here today. And first of all, it's my pleasure to introduce the panel for you. We will hear a bit more about their work in the first round, but Juita Gupta, Frank Bierman, Sandra Pellegrom, Danielle Heers, and Sebastien Treillet. My French is... and I think a special welcome to Sandra and Daniela, because they have taken the time out of their normal professional work at the ministry and at the NGO, and as well as running for a political career, to come to this academic session here and this meeting here today to share their experience and engage in the discussion. So we are very happy with that. And before I'll introduce the program a bit further, I'd like to give the floor to my colleague Timo Maas. Timo is coordinator on the work we do for the Ministry of Development Cooperation at PBL, and he has been the mastermind behind this session. So, Timo, can you tell us a little bit more about the ideas that you have had in organizing this session and what you want to get out of this for the work we do at PBL?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Hi, everyone. As PBL, we have quite a direct working relationship with Dutch ministries, which is very interesting and a unique opportunity. At PBL, I coordinate the work that we do with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, particularly on environment and international development. And I think for many here in the room as well, sort of environment and international development are just two sides of the same coin. And we see that increasingly in policy ambitions and discourse that is too. But then when we talk to the policymakers who we interact with on a weekly, monthly basis, we also see their struggles into making sense of what is going on there, and what is different about sustainable development to policy coherence, what is different about that to just transitions. And our role as PBL is to help them make sense of that. And I think we at PBL are also still sort of trying to get to grips with what this means and what's this emergence, arguably, of justice in this discourse means. So we thought it would be really interesting because we can imagine that many people here in the ESG community are also grappling with that and are working on that. So we thought this is a great opportunity to have a session that focuses on these questions and explores them in more depth. If you're keen to explore more or to work with us or to know more about our work, please find me after the session and we'll exchange contact details.
Thanks, Timo. Very helpful as a start of the session. So we want to take the discussion in 4 rounds. First, we get to learn some of the background of our panelists, and as a sort of a starting point and setting the stage of the further discussions. And then we, in a second round, want to think about the question: what's actually new in this whole discussion on bringing more to the fore the issue of justice? This has, of course, been on the table for many years, and why is it emerging right now? What is becoming different, and how do we make sense of that? Then in the second round, that's actually the third round, we go into the issue of governance. So what are the sort of new options for policy making that come out of a discussion on justice to what is new directions of becoming more effective in the way we govern for sustainability? And then in the last round, as a contribution to the Nijmegen agenda on inter and transdisciplinarity, we like to hear your thoughts of, well, what does this imply for this longer-term research agenda on these topics? From the second round onward, we invite you, audience, to participate in the discussion. So be ready to ask your questions to the panel, so that we hopefully get a nice interactive discussion on this. Timo will also monitor the chat, so for the audience online, raise your questions as well. Timo will bring them into the discussions as good as possible. So that by way of introduction from my end, and well, let's start. And I'd like to start with Danielle, and I'm going to give you the mic. So Danielle Hirsch is director of Both Ends. Both Ends is a Dutch NGO working on sustainable, fair and inclusive world through collaboration with environmental justice groups in the Global South. She's also standing as a candidate for the upcoming elections for the Dutch Parliament to be held on November 22. So we're also curious to hear what she's going to take from these discussions to politics. Daniela, can you tell us a bit more about what Both Ends does, what kind of activities you do, and what you aim to achieve with that?
Thank you very much, and also thank you for having me. I always enjoy having discussions with people that are in science, because I think it's so important to have science ask the right questions and come up with answers that maybe are politically not very welcome, but need to be said in a very loud voice. And even more now, when justice issues get to the agenda and generate a lot of controversy and polarization. So we need you more than ever to keep these debates on the right course. So I'm really happy to be here. And Both Ends is I would say, an environment and human rights NGO, an environmental justice NGO, and we see ourselves as part of the global environmental movement. And as part of that movement, we have a role to play in the Netherlands, because if we talk about sustainability and you look at the footprint and all the policies, the broader set of foreign policies that the Netherlands has as an open economy, as a trading nation, we do everything contrary to sustainable development. So we are a tax haven, we are one of the biggest traders in agriculture goods, we're an importer of deforestation, and on and on and on. And we feel that since we think we're part of the problem, and a problem that is causing a lot of negative effects for people all over the world, we need to get that on the table and also we need to be willing to become part of the solution, because if we would change something in our foreign policies, that would have a huge positive effect on how people and nature and everything can develop also beyond our own borders.
Thank you. That is a very good opening statement. So from your experience and your partnering with organizations throughout the world, what do you see as the main obstacles in achieving these objectives that you just mentioned, and what are signs of hope for you?
I think one of the biggest belemmeringen? Obstacles, sorry. Are certain dogmas that are running around. And in the Netherlands, that would be the Netherlands is too small to make a difference, whereas we're not. Or the market is going to arrange everything. Or big companies don't do politics, right? Whereas that's almost the only thing they're doing. So there is a series, and there's also this problem that we have to talk about power and interest. So if things are not going in the way that we would like them to go, instead of asking what's going wrong, it might be interesting to see who benefits and what do these people and institutions do to keep things as they are. So I think some of the ideas that go around in our societies needs to be questioned much more strongly. But we also need to look at power questions, which is of course the mirror image of talking about justice. So that's one, and what gives me hope is that I work with an enormous amount of people that do these things in their own countries, in their own municipalities. They stand up to the powerful. They challenge the powers that be in a way that is also scientifically sound. So it's not only that people stand on the streets and shout because they don't want things to happen. Increasingly, they use research, they do their own research, and I think on the basis of proof, we're winning. But it's just a power struggle that we're not there. But I think people know increasingly, also in the Netherlands, what we're up against.
Thanks. Maybe you want to give the microphone indeed to Sandra. And I think, Sandra, one of your tasks is to take up one of the challenges that Daniela just posed. Sandra is the national coordinator for the SDGs at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And in that role, she promotes the national implementation of the SDGs in and by the Netherlands. She works closely with other ministries and organizations within our national government, but also with the broad SDG movement in our country, including business, municipalities, provinces, NGOs, youth organizations, and knowledge and educational institutions. Sandra, maybe you can tell a little bit more about understanding your role. So what do you do in your daily life? What is the mandate that you have? What is outside of your purview? And maybe also asking the question, since you're based in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, why are you not based at the Ministry of our Prime Minister if you're responsible for national implementation of the SDGs?
A whole load of questions to start with. Let's get right into it. Yes, my task is really to, on behalf of the central government, to encourage all parties in society to contribute to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals nationally. But of course, there's a clear link also to our international policies. I'm not responsible for those, but we do try to make clear that what you do domestically and what you do externally are, ideally really supporting each other, and that's also the goal. I'm a civil servant, so I speak here as a civil servant, not as a politician. That's good to know. The cabinet and different subsequent governments have, of course, embraced the Sustainable Development Goals since they were adopted in 2015, and also said, yes, this is also an assignment for the Netherlands. We need to also achieve these goals nationally, because there's such a clear link between national and international. We all need to do our part. The cabinet then decided that clearly each minister that has a specific SDG in their portfolio is responsible for that SDG, but it would be helpful if one minister has a bit of a encouraging, coordinating role. And because of the knowledge available in the foreign ministry, it was decided that the Minister for Foreign Trade and Development would be that coordinating minister, hence my positioning under that minister in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Of course, it's a choice you make. There's also countries where different decisions were made. Sometimes this function that I have is in the Ministry for the Environment, sometimes in the Ministry of Finance, often also in the ministry under the Prime Minister in different countries. Really depends on the political culture and the decision of every specific country.
Okay, thanks. Clear. Maybe a similar question as I asked to Daniela. In your work as SDG coordinator, you come at a lot of places, you meet a lot of people. What is giving you hope, and when do you get frustrated, or what do you like to see changed?
I think we all hover between hope and fear very often in this field that we are all working in. I think the daunting challenge that we all face in the coming years is really that we need to both make speed and to really deepen our understanding and to make the connections between all these different goals. So if you want to take the analogy of, going somewhere, sometimes it might be faster to dive into that tunnel towards one specific goal, really fast. But that's not what we can do. We need to take the winding road across the mountains of complexity, basically, where we have a wider view and we can connect all these different goals and understand also how one thing links to another. Justice to green transitions, as we are discussing today. Obviously, that is not as fast as the tunnel, but we still need to make haste. So it's a big challenge. I really feel that, and I think a lot of us feel that. What gives me hope is really like you also said, the energy and the speed with which you see this understanding changing, and you see people picking it up in all sectors and really starting the conversation and starting to think about, okay, but how can we address these issues? So I think there's a lot of hope in the energy and the speed actually at which we are starting to understand, what we need to understand better and what we need to do better.
Thank you. If you would be so kind to give the mic to Joeita. Joeita is Professor of Environment and Development in the Global South at the Amsterdam Institute of Social Science Research at the University of Amsterdam. That's a full mouthful. And the IEHE Delft Institute for Water Education. She's also co-chair of the Earth Commission. And this year she was awarded with the highest academic prize in the Netherlands, the Spinoza Prize, for her work on inequitable distribution of effects of climate change and how that can be resolved through good governance. So, Joeita, at yesterday's semi-plenary, I understood you and your colleagues discussed the Earth system boundaries. And if we talk about complexity, and I read your paper a little bit, there's a lot of complexity in the paper you try to deal with. Yeah, maybe very briefly, can you introduce that concept and what does bring to the discussions on justice, and also in comparison to, for example, related concept like planetary boundaries?
So in 2009, there was a paper written on planetary boundaries, and there was some degree of critique from the social science community. The planetary boundaries were trying to say that if you crossed a certain number in relation to a particular environmental domain, then the system would become unstable. And they had a large number of domains at that time, and there was a lot of critique about that, but the planetary boundaries movement has gone further, and we still get publications from them. In the Earth Commission, one of the critiques was that the planetary boundary number is too abstract. It's a global number and we don't know how to deal with it. So we also started to look at boundaries at local to global level, and we have a boundary at 1 cubic meter to regional level to all the way to global level. So that's a difference between the planetary boundaries concept. The other thing is that the planetary boundaries focus on safety. And when they're talking about safety, they're talking about the safety of the system. And when does a system collapse? So whether it's a biosphere system, or it's a climate system, or the water system. And we argued that long before the system collapses, there are major injustices happening in the world which should be taken into account. So we need to have a just boundary as well. And of course, that led to a lot of debate because people argued that justice is a normative concept, it's not scientific, so it would weaken the whole scientific narrative. And we argued back that you can do justice scientifically too. You can analyze, for example, what the literature on justice says and try to come up with some common definitions. And so we had this sort of debate, and we finally reached the conclusion that we must try and find out what is a just boundary. And I'll only give you one example. I see Haro right at the back of the room, Haro van Asselt. We were both part of a project early in the 2000s looking at how do you define Article 2 of the Climate Convention. And at that time, we did a stakeholder analysis in the Netherlands, and we concluded that 2 degrees was just for the Netherlands. And I remember that the gentleman representing the Agriculture Ministry said, well, the world may not be able to produce food, but we will be able to produce food in the Netherlands, and we will provide everybody with food. So for us, 2 degrees is fine. You know, so it was a really strange narrative. And we then thought, Haro and I, that we should try to do the same exercise in different parts of the world to see whether it's 2 degrees is just in different parts of the world. And, well, we were not lucky in raising money. We tried a couple of times and we gave up. And now we were able to bring it back onto the agenda. The 2 degrees is not just, 1.5 is not just. Because already at 1 degree, tens of millions of people are dying. So we tried to quantify justice. That did not work out too well. But what we did manage to say is that we think that 1 degree is a more just target than 1.5. And we did similar exercises for all the different domains that we chose. And we came up with some targets were safe and just, and some targets were made more stringent to take into account the justice dilemma.
Okay. Thanks for clarifying that. So in your ideal world, what role would you like to see the Earth system boundaries play in decision making?
So Our Earth Commission doesn't look at Earth system boundaries alone. We also look at, for example, what would it mean if we gave all human beings access to basic resources? And we see that if we do that for those people below the minimum, we already cross the boundaries significantly. And that basically means you have to completely transform the entire system because you don't have a corridor. We showed yesterday that we are outside the safe and just boundary for 7 out of 8 domains, and that 86% of the world's population is affected today by the fact that we're outside these domains. So therefore, we think that it's not just the boundaries at the top, we also have the argument about the floor, and we have calculated that in terms of the same units as were used for the boundaries. So we can actually calculate exactly how much space there is in the corridor for each of the domains that we have taken. So we're really talking about global transformation, not just boundaries. And the next question is, how do you do that, and how do you do it in a just manner?
Okay. Yeah, thanks. Let's give the mic to Sébastien. Sébastien Treillet is the Executive Director of IDRI, Institut de Développement Durable et Relations Internationales.
Your French is beautiful, Marcel.
I practiced 10 times, thank you. Sébastien is also chairman of the French Committee for the Global Environmental Facility, and he and his institute closely follows the negotiations on climate, biodiversity and SDGs, and also put this discussion in a geopolitical context, which I think is very pertinent at the current state of affairs in the world today. So Sébastien, as I said, part of your work proceeds to engaging with what happens in the Rio Conventions. Can you tell us a bit more about how issues of global justice come to the fore in these discussions, and what challenges that pose to international negotiations?
Thanks a lot, Marcel, and I'm really happy to be here with this community of researchers and stakeholders. That's really a very interesting panel that you've set up. I will not try to make a full account of the different Rio Conventions, but really find in the Paris Agreement a kind of an example of something that was supposed to be, with the Paris Agreement, both effective, efficient and just, but that might be questioned. The fairest way to go forward to try and move ambitious climate action everywhere was the idea that the Paris Agreement would be universal, but that there would be a bottom-up perspective where every country would be defining their own pathway to the transformation towards sustainability, probably with their own specific rhythm, their own specific path, and the time horizon can be differing, but that everybody needs to change. And I think that's the same philosophy of action that is also behind the Agenda 2030. And we are at IDRI as a think tank trying to stick to that and make that happen. How do we try to do that? First, I take 2 examples, not to be too long. The first one is that we believe that it's very important that the definition of what is the long-term transformation pathway, for instance, for the decarbonization of the energy system in Senegal, first has to do with the extension of access to electricity for Senegalese people and for the industrialization of Senegal, and that this needs to come first and needs to be supported by, as my colleague Professor Chukwumerije Okereke says, indigenous expertise, meaning that the national expertise needs to be existing to define what is the pathway for prosperity for Senegal and to what extent this is relying on it can be made compatible with decarbonization. I could talk about the same thing about being nature positive, but there's still much we don't explore that much. We hope we can explore that with PBL actually, but that's what I can discuss with you afterwards. But that's something that is really important, to start from the needs of the country, and we really believe that defining those long-term pathways, which is one, I think it's Article 4, I don't know, I'm always bad at articles to quote them, but from the Paris Agreement, there is an incentive for countries to develop not only their NDC, their nationally determined contribution to 2030, but the long-term vision. And I think that's really important because it can be done always taking into account the specificity of each country. It's not just about having the government make a plan. It's not just, of course, having the government ask McKinsey to develop a plan. I'm quoting McKinsey not because they're always easy to quote as the bad guy. It's that in Nigeria, the government asked McKinsey to develop an energy transformation plan, and it has no ownership locally, and it's not credible internationally because it's not sure that it is grounded on indigenous expertise, meaning that the variety of stakeholders in Nigeria believe in the data that was used, that they can adjust the plan if necessary. So it's really about having national expertise in government and outside of government, because if we want those plans to be just internally and just in the relation with the external world, we need to ensure that there is sufficient space for political space for discussion about what is the plan, what are the scenarios, and what is the plan that we choose. And in that regard, having space for NGOs locally is also extremely important. So that's what we try to do. We have an initiative called Deep Decarbonization Pathways that links together different. Generally, it's energy economists in academia, in the major economies, but also now in also least developed countries that are developing their own pathway and that talk to one another also for some kind of mentorship, but also to bring back some lessons to the international scale. In the framework of the global stocktake, I want to pay homage to Harald Winkler in University of Cape Town in that network. He was that very useful expert who participated to the official global stocktake of UNFCCC. I'm not going into details of what that means, but that is we are at the very important moment of COP28 where we need to take stock of what we've done and what we have not done. And Harald was able to facilitate an intergovernmental, but also a conversation that was also populated with experts to try and say what is it that is blocking accelerated action in our countries. And I think they have extremely politically meaningful messages. For instance, one is it's very important to deploy very rapidly renewables, and that's very important particularly for a country like Senegal. But if you don't work on the demand for fossil fuel at the same time, you're not going to get there. And that, in the context of a COP that is headed by United Arab Emirates, is a very important message. I was not sure that this would come through, and that came through. But more importantly for our discussion, they also come back with questions saying, we are not going to be able to accelerate our transformation if we don't have the international framework that works. And that's about international justice that is at stake. But I see that I'm already talking too much, and we need to come back to other types of questions. But the other example that I wanted to say is that we're also very keen on exchanging between African sustainability think tanks and European sustainability think tanks to understand why is it that we still don't understand each other. I mean, our governments say that they understand each other, but it's not true about green industrialization in both our continents. And that's also something where we need to really get to grips with the major problems about justice that are embedded in those relations between Europe and Africa. But I can go back to that afterwards.
I was interested in the paper you published on with David Abura on the shared planet. And I think that makes sort of similar raises similar questions and arguments as you just raised. Can you tell a bit more about that analysis, also in the context of agriculture, food production, and biodiversity?
So I'm extremely honored to have been able to publish a paper with David, who's a close friend of Idri, and now he's the chair of IPBS. So that's really a great achievement for IPBS to have such a wonderful president. What we try to explain with David was to say so David had already published a paper saying in biodiversity we try to organize land use planning and to preserve some areas. And that's basically the way we look at biodiversity action, saying we need to preserve 30%. And that was one of the key goals that came out of COP15 on biodiversity. But if you want to implement that for many African countries, and I'm quoting there David Obura from Kenya, we need to think that if it's a top-down way to say what part of Kenya should we set aside, this is not going to work, and this is not meaningful for countries in Africa where you need to develop a lot of infrastructures, a pathway to industrialization, because there are so many people who are going to have to find decent jobs with a decent income. And that's about infrastructure building. So you need to rather start from maybe a bottom-up perspective where biodiversity protection could be an asset in some part of Kenya for the rural development of that region, and then building up the pathway to a nature positive development in one country. But trying to put biodiversity as an asset for development, which might be a contradiction in terms, but we need to do that way, because top-down would not be functioning.
Thank you. Then maybe the mic can go to Frank. So Frank Bierman is Professor of Global Sustainability Governance at the Copernicus Institute for Sustainable Development at Utrecht University. He's been founder and first chair of the Earth System Governance Program. And in his latest ERC grant on global goals, he led a team to investigate whether, to what extent and why or why not the SDGs have any political effect so far. So I think after also having heard some of the earlier comments, it would be really nice if you can give us a sort of a brief summary of the assessment you made in your book and recent paper on this.
I try a brief one. Thanks so much. Thanks for the invitation. I think it's fantastic planning also in the composition. I think that's really a model for Earth System Governance conferences, to bring together some of the scientists, but also decision makers from NGOs, from think tanks. I think it's a great way of bringing the community together with those who are really taking decisions and are very effective and bring them about. So for the research, I can just make this is a research program at Utrecht, but it's also a task force of the Earth System Governance Project. So for those of you who are interested in the SDGs and to study them, there's a large community out there and everybody can join. We have a meeting on Friday to better understand these SDGs. And just bringing about the SDGs, what is the SDGs? It's a new model of the United Nations. It's a new type of steering that the UN came up with. The idea that we have a target corridor for sustainable development with 17 goals and 169 targets. And the question that we are asking here at Governance Scholars is, does it make a difference? Does it make any difference in the Netherlands or France or any other countries that these countries have signed up to 17 global goals and 169 targets? And this is what we want to understand. We still do this kind of research. What we have done is we have looked at 3,000 scientific studies on the SDGs, trying to understand whether they have any political effect, an effect on institutions, an effect on norms, an effect of discourses, at the global level, at the national level, on different other types of questions we had. And the key finding was that despite the great efforts of Sandra and all her colleagues, there is very tiny effects. I mean, we couldn't really find much effect on political systems at the global level in many, many countries. And we are trying now to understand, why is this the case? I mean, why is it the case that these SDGs do not have any strong impact? And one example, if I might add, in a sense, it is quite striking that in the Netherlands, SDGs are being defined through the foreign policy system. Because normally would expect this is a case for the country, and some countries do it also at the level of prime ministers, at the level of presidents and national committees. But I think for the Netherlands, it's quite striking that this country and also some others defining the SDGs through the foreign policy system, seeing it not as an issue primarily for the Netherlands, but seeing it as an issue that comes to the Netherlands through the foreign policy system, despite the great work that Sandra is doing. I mean, there's no doubt about that, of course, but it is not seen as institutionally, primarily as a national domestic issue to be implemented. This comes from the development. I mean, this comes from development thinking, UN thinking, and I think, I mean, in generally, it could have been done differently, to put it this way, in this country and maybe also in other countries. And this is what we try to study in this task force. We try to study variation. And we try, of course, we have only 7 years left for the SDGs. We try now also to develop proposals on what could be done better. I mean, what could be done better? What is our message to the political system to improve and rescue the SDGs, as the UN Secretary General said? And this is kind of some of the research questions we are trying to answer now for the next couple of years. And if you're interested, the task force meets next Friday and everybody is invited to join.
I think Sandra needs the answers right now because she has 7 years left.
I was wondering if I would get it. Of course, I have
maybe we ask Frank for his answers right now to help you in getting things on a better course, because you say we're going to study it for the coming years, but surely you must have some ideas of what to do next, because this is an urgent question. So I dare you to... No, you.
Me or Frank?
Frank. I'd like to hear Frank. I want to help you, Sandra.
Okay. Well, I mean, there are some ideas about the SDGs. I mean, one idea is that we have a new paper that came out just in September. One idea is that the SDGs have the same standard for all countries. And it makes, on the one hand, makes a great sense. So the breakdown, the global north, global south, a dichotomy that was typical for the Millennium Development Goals. But what we found is that it gives industrialized countries an excuse. In many ways, industrialized countries have the possibility of kind of cherry picking in a sense. I mean, like hunger has been resolved and these kind of things. So it was easier in a way to get out. So we would argue, some of us would argue, who have signed this article that we have just published, that we need to have a kind of differentiation to put higher standards, higher expectations, and higher commitments on the industrialized countries, high-income countries. That's number one. Another one, what could say, that the fact that the SDGs are not legally binding is a problem, in a way, from implementation, because they are not really part of the legislative process, and that is, I would say, one of the shortcomings that are not making that more effective, compared, for example, with the Climate Convention that has a higher status, legally binding, and then leads also to court cases, climate litigation, etc., etc. There's no SDG litigation, for example. We do not expect that all the 17 goals and 169 targets become legally binding, but we are proposing a global network of plurilateral treaties where countries are getting together and trying to enforce and strengthen their commitments on some of the SDGs by legally binding treaties. Plastic treaty is one example. The Treaty on High Sea Fisheries is an example. So there are treaties in these directions. We propose more in this direction. And we have some other ideas about institutionalization, like not having the SDGs as part of a foreign policy system, that's one, but having it at a central cross-cutting issue that runs in the political system at the highest political level and is not being delegated to the forces. We're upgrading Sandra's role in a sense. That's one of the many proposals that we have.
Okay, good, thanks. So I think we have a very rich overview now of the work you do and different perspectives you take on the sort of common agenda of environment and development and the aspect of justice. And what we were wondering about is that this whole aspect of justice in the sustainability development debate is nothing new. It's part of the Rio principles. I think it's been in the back of many people's mind, but it has risen on the agenda, and I'd like to hear your understanding of why this is happening right now, and why it is different compared to maybe a couple of years ago, and maybe 2 or 3 of you are very eager to take this question up, and then I'd like to give also turn to the audience to raise questions to the panel. So who likes the mic? Sandra and then Joita.
Just because this is so close to the core of the Sustainable Development Goals, because for the SDGs this is not a new thought. I think the whole point of the SDGs when they were adopted in 2015 is the recognition that sustainability, you cannot do it half. You have to be all in, because all these goals are interconnected. Green transitions, human well-being, justice, they're all part and parcel of the SDG agenda. They come back in different goals. In many of the goals, there's a lot of attention to fair distribution, to access for everyone, equal access to all these different goals. There's specific goals on reducing inequalities between countries and between people, specific goal on peaceful, just and inclusive societies. So I think for the SDGs, this is, the bread and butter of the SDGs. Leaving no one behind is the core principle of the SDGs. What I think has changed, and we had a really great lecture of the American professor Jeffrey Sachs, who many of you probably know as one of the, engineers maybe, but in any case, a strong supporter of the Millennium Development Goals, and then also very much involved in the Sustainable Development Goals. And he said in his lecture, I think he put it very well, he said, we've adopted these goals and we know how important they are. They're just becoming more relevant with every new crisis that we see around us. But we're only just starting to realize what it requires to actually achieve them, and to achieve them, not just a few, but to achieve the whole range of the goals. We're only just starting to see what needs to be done, and we're still figuring that out. And one of the major aspects of that, I think, is this recognition that, yes, it has to be a just transition, but how? And what does that entail?
Yeah, so I think there is a big shift, because the richer nations now have inside, like we do in the Netherlands, a growing amount of people that are suffering from the same injustices as the global South have been suffering for decennia. So we see it with the large-scale industrial complexes here in the Netherlands, like the steel producers, with the airport, in Groningen with fossil fuel extraction. I think there is a growing push from inside industrialized countries that shows that these kinds of injustices are no longer acceptable. So there is, rather than a national process going on, there's a global, it's a reflection of the globalized economy, and people find each other over borders. So I think we have to be very careful not to only talk about countries, but we have to start thinking in groups of people that are suffering injustices and how to make sure that they're visible and how they can be strengthened to get their voice out, and then the justice issue will remain on the agenda, because that's what people do once they suffer through things. So I think the injustices are becoming increasingly visible. And I also would like to just, I may be staying in the vijver, I'm just want to throw things out. So we're talking about the SDGs, it's an ambition agenda. The human rights are there, but they're not explicitly as goals. So I think we have to be, if we talk about justice and the SDGs, I think it's good to realize that there are legal frameworks out there that are going to help us to redress injustices. But we do have to strengthen those and not forget to strengthen those as a basic condition to achieve the goals that we're setting out to achieve.
So I'll take a slightly different angle, but come to the same conclusion. If you look at environmental resources worldwide, whether it's water or greenhouse gas emissions or minerals or metals, they're limited. So if you imagine a cake, that cake is what you have to share between people, between countries. And as you move towards the future, this cake keeps shrinking, especially if you look at climate change. So 20 years ago, we could emit quite a lot of greenhouse gas emissions. But as we move towards 2050, this cake is going to shrink. And as this cake is going to shrink, there are more of us wanting a little piece of that cake. And that's why the demand for justice will increase more and more. 30 years ago, it was slightly theoretical, but now you see it's increasing much more on each of these fronts. So on climate globally, but on water locally, and between countries as well. That's one way to look at it. The second way to look at it is in terms of unequal exchange between countries and between people. And you find this that throughout, from the colonial period onwards till today, there's always been a sort of unequal exchange between rich people and poor people, rich countries and poor countries. And this basically means that the accumulation of wealth concentrates in people, for example, like me. And there are other people in the rest of the world that get more and more squeezed. And in the semi-plenary yesterday, we talked about electric cars. And we're talking about this electric revolution. And at the other end, we're marginalizing people who are using the minerals to make these electric cars and polluting their water. So in each of these processes, somehow, to solve the problem, we're exacerbating inequality. So from both perspectives, what I think is the justice problem will keep on increasing as we move into the future, and there'll be more and more demands worldwide.
Thanks. Hold your comments about Frank and Sebastian. I'd like to turn to the audience. I see already hands coming up, and maybe we person with the mic. So we lady here in front, and then you, and then we.
Thank you very much.
Could you please introduce yourself and be sure that you talk in the mic for the audience?
Can you hear me? Yes?
Yes.
Hello. Thank you very much for the panelists for this interesting discussion. I'm Albertine van den Busche from Wageningen University. And I wanted to raise a point on a tension that seems to appear between aligning SDGs that you mentioned, Daniele, between the national level, the Dutch case in that case, and global South countries, and what Sebastian Trey said to start to what the global South country wants and not imposing things. So given your experience with politics, or at least policies of SDG, could you give an example of an SDG cooperation initiative between the Netherlands and a global South country where synergies and more tension arose between how to achieve an SDG and how did you approach it and overcome it, maybe? Thank you.
Thank you. You had a question as well, or no? Otherwise, no.
Thank you as well. My name is Ingrid Boas. I'm also from Wageningen University, apparently same university. I had a question for Sebastian. You mentioned indigenous expertise, and just wondered if you could elaborate a little bit on that, on how you engage with that, how you mean that, especially, for instance, in Senegal, there are many different groups, and also nomadic groups that don't per se have, for instance, a Senegalese nationality, but do live there like fishers and pastoralists, and I don't know. Just wondered how you see that indigenous expertise in relation to justice questions also.
Let's collect 2 more questions. I think the gentleman in the back there was very quick raising, and you as well. So, and then I promise I turn to the left side of the room. Sorry.
Hi, Lukas Hermwille from the Wuppertal Institute in Germany. I just wanted to provide a perspective on the last comments on just transition. We just had a session on just transition in Europe, and there we found that basically, at least in the legal sense and in most of the literature, actually finds that just transition is mostly about compensating labor and profit and not so much everything else. I think we are talking so much about just transition because privileged groups are anticipating that some of that privilege will go away. That's why they're pushing this just transition narrative. But I think it is a good opportunity to refocus that debate towards the real and the underlying injustices that have been produced by the incumbent fossil fuel system in the past. And one other aspect that we've discussed there is kind of the justice dimensions of the transformation, the opportunities that come with the transformation, where there is kind of no debate about who gets to reap the benefits of the new system. It won't be just and equal by default, so we also need to work on that. I just wanted to prompt you to think about how we can actually maybe make this just transition debate more fruitful and more cohesive than just talking about very rich and very well-earning miners that might lose their job.
Thank you. Hi, Norman Kearney from the University of Bern. Brief statement, then some questions for you. Leading up to this conference with some colleagues at the Stockholm Environment Institute and the International Institute for Sustainable Development, we ran a survey where we reached out to the business community, government, civil society, and research, and we asked for their thoughts on how to accelerate the Sustainable Development Goals up to 2030 and beyond. And we're just starting to look at the data because our survey is actually still open, but so far we found 151 positive system changes that could help to accelerate SDGs and 71 negative ones. And we've tried to cluster them, and we found it was a lot easier to cluster the negative system changes. They were much more coherent and clear, so there was like clarity on the problem side. And on the solution side, the 151 positive system changes, they were really quite diverse, and so we had like clarity on the problem and confusion on the solution, or diversity at least. And so I was wondering, in your work or your perspective, do you also see it this way, that there's like strong agreement or a strong sense or maybe even just confidence on the problem side and then quite a lot of disagreement or difference of ideas, perhaps quite validly, on the solution side? Is this a problem? Do we need a common transformation framework? If so, how? And if not, what to do?
Thanks. We have already a very rich set of questions. I see that there are more hands, and I'm sure we will come back to you. So please be a bit patient. Maybe Sebastian and Frank, you start with taking some of the questions you like to address from the audience, and then.
Thank you very much. Just on the indigenous expertise, I quoted actually my colleague from Nigeria who was trying to use the word indigenous in a very extended way, saying Nigerian expertise rather than cosmopolitan global expertise. So that was trying to build in the country the expertise. And so it was not exactly what your question was about. But nevertheless, I believe one very important thing, particularly when we are going to discuss the Global Biodiversity Framework implementation, is to ensure that the assessment of where we are in the progress is made by mobilizing indigenous people and local communities, and they are organizing to do that. And I think that's, so I'm not able to answer your question how you do that better, but I think there are already indigenous people and local communities organized to do a global review from their perspective, and that's really promising to me. The other thing that I wanted to say is two things. First, there is this wonderful report by PowerShift Africa, Fadel Kaboub, Yuba Sokona on just transition, where they say we can build a future of opportunities for our countries that is aligned with green industrialization, but we need to tackle the root causes of the very asymmetrical structure of the international economic order, to use words that are quite converging, I believe, with what Joyita was saying. And so they say we need to, there is one thing that is stopping SDG implementation, is the fact that if we build global supply chains that are as unequal as today for instance, many countries in Africa, because they're out of those supply chains and pushed back into a position of being raw material exporters, that's not going to function. So that's one thing that we need to do to change the thing. And when you look at what was discussed in the SDG Summit, not a lot of action, but in terms of the analysis, there was lots of very interesting things. And the first thing to say is we need to have a stimulus finance plan. That's the UNSG pushing that. But also we need to really discuss illegal financial flows and many other things that are making this international economic order. I'm using the wording of 1972 on purpose. We need to change that. The other thing that I want to say, and I want to pay homage to the expert group of the Global Sustainable Development Report. I think that Elsa is over there from SCI, who was one of the 15 authors of that report. They made it very clear that beyond the issue that we have this problem with unequal economic relations, in countries, what is blocking us is not that we don't know the path, the diversity of pathways to transformation, is that we know the path for transformation, but the social and political conditions for the negotiations are extremely complicated and sometimes not there. That's my interpretation, also. You might correct me. And that needs a lot of institutional capacity in countries and between countries. I think the list is about foresight and planning. It's about what I had in mind, science and national expertise, but also the political space for civil society. And something that I found, I don't know if I'm using the right words that is used in the GSDR, but it's about capacity to deliberate and negotiate politically. And that capacity in our societies is failing everywhere. And not because of, I don't believe it's failing because of environmental problems. It's fading because of the fact that our societies are, I don't know, it's more about the economic forces and the political forces that are making our social fabric disintegrate. And that's, to me, a real problem. If we are not able to maintain institutions that enable us to negotiate and deliberate, that's going to be functioning nowhere. And that's, I think, one very interesting question asked by the Global Sustainable Development Report. How can we cultivate, nurture, build up again those capacities to democratically negotiate? Democratically, I mean, even in countries that would not be named democracies, there are ways to at least have a deliberation between the interests at stake to make it fairer. And that's something that I think is really the problem that we need to, I don't know how to solve that, but that's the type of thing that we need to nurture.
Thanks. Frank.
Good, great question. Thank you so much. To start with justice, I would disagree that it's new. It has been a continuous fight for hundreds of years for justice. And you mentioned the 1970s. And this, I think, was historically one of the biggest fights for global South, global North justice, when the global South called for a new international economic order, trying to change the entire global environmental system. Some of you might remember these times in a sense. And that was a failure. It didn't work out. That is also to be recognized. So justice has been on the agenda for many, many years. The global South has fought for justice, and it was not successful in 1970. What has changed, and here I agree with Joyita, it has changed the urgency. So the cake that Joyita referred to is indeed shrinking, and that brings justice in new ways forward, and that makes it a new type of issue. It's not that justice is not new on the agenda, but the way of justice being framed, the conflicts, they are new. But we have to also understand the historicity that it has been the issue. We have to understand how it has been failed to be recognized in the past. For the SDGs, I think one important point is to see the SDGs not necessarily as a very uniform thing, because they're very different in the way. I mean, people are doing master theses about SDG 13. I discourage this in a sense, because it's just climate. It's a kind of reference to the climate issue. Some of these SDGs are very weak. Some of them are easy to achieve. So there's a huge diversity. And then many of these studies that look at the SDGs are kind of confused in a sense, because they don't take the diversity, the difference in the SDGs into account. And then for justice, I think what is very important, that was mentioned, the trade relationships, for example, was mentioned by Judita, but others also. I think a key progressive agenda is to change the system of the United Nations, which has been emerged in the 1940s. It has not been changed since then. I think it's very important to see the underlying power structures in the UN system. It's not the only solution, but I think it's a very important part, a progressive agenda for progressive countries and parties and movements to change the ways how the international system functions. I think that's very important. And that should be also part of the research agenda to bring it forward. And leading the point is also not only justice, we also have, this is my fourth point, to recognize or to analyze the increases in injustice, actually. It's not only injustice in the way that Judita mentions, also that, but also the trend to authoritarian regimes, the trends that many of us are losing elections chronically in a sense, and there's a fair chance, I mean, that we have many European countries, for example, with very right-wing governments, and this is an emerging trend. And this is also very important to take this into account, the emergence of injustice, the emergence of non-democratic authoritarian regimes, and also at the global level, new types of imperialist, new types of colonial solutions. One of them is geoengineering that some of us are active with, which is essentially a kind of a colonial way of dealing with issues of climate change by bringing a global power solution, which is not a solution, which is kind of an injustice solution to these issues. And that is also very important to take into account in our discussions.
Thanks, Frank. Danielle, Sandra, you want to comment some of the questions?
I'd like to say something about your question, because I agree, we know the problems. Of course, if we know the problems, why don't we solve them, right? So, and I think there's a bigger question behind it, and I talked about it in the beginning. There's just too much big interest why we don't address the problem since limits to growth, or whatever you want to call it. And I also think that we are maybe stuck in the conviction that we have to know the right answers. So I get into many conversations where I put an issue on the table, and you're sort of diminished if you're not having the right answer. There is no right answer. And if there would have been a right answer, it would have been implemented. And I think we have to realize that if we talk about a transition, we talk about a process where we will do things right and we will do things wrong. So I think that the whole thing calls for a totally different attitude, both for those that, you know, in science, but also those in finance and in government, to try out the things that seemingly are the right things to do, and stop being so afraid of making a mistake, because there's only one thing that we're sure of. If we continue like we're going now, we are in a very, very bad situation. So you cannot ever do anything worse than wait for the right answer.
Yeah, it's a very good one. I just want to mention a couple of things that we do in terms of policies and within the government, also maybe to counter Frank's perspective that so little is being done. On the side of development partnering with the Global South, we actually have a lot of recognition of the effects of, you know, our internal policies on other countries, the footprint discussion, the negative spillovers. We even, as I think the first, but maybe still the only country in the world that has a specific policy plan to address negative spillover effects on developing countries, which is in its third iteration, has existed since 2016, and has recently been reviewed to become even more ambitious and also to include more specific, smart targets so that we can actually report to Parliament whether we're achieving them. It's about our climate footprint, our land footprint, our water footprint. It's about our tax footprint. And it's about our global health footprint, but, you know, translated into how can we ensure more, for instance, vaccination equality worldwide. So these things are government policies, are in there. Our Minister for Foreign Trade and Development, Minister Schrijnemacher, has published her policy note last year. And it also has an innovation in terms of, in our aid and trade policy, which we've combined for many years already. We're now focusing on a partnership with a number of specific middle-income countries to see how we can support transitions, green and just transitions in these countries. This is new, so we don't have all the answers yet, and still we have started to just sort of figure it out and try to see where we get as we go along in partnership with these countries. And very much the other thing which is also increasingly taken into account is this issue of localization, using local, indigenous, if you want, knowledge, people, stakeholders to find the solutions that work in a specific location. One example from our domestic policies, I think there's a lot of attention in our climate transition policy for the aspect of leaving no one behind. How does it relate to education, to the job market, to opportunities for people in the job market because they get the right type of future-oriented education, both within the climate policy and very strongly also within our policy to achieve a circular economy by 2050. These are part and parcel, these issues are part and parcel of these policies. So we are really trying to look at these things in a more integrated way. Finally, the point that you made, very interesting. I'm very interested in your research, so I'll find you after this session. I think it really reflects also what we find in our reporting to Parliament. We report to Parliament every year on how we are achieving the SDGs in the Netherlands. We've used the advice of the Global Sustainable Development Report of the UN, which I think you're right is excellent. Everybody should read it. We've started reporting not against every single SDG in a silo, because the point of the SDGs is the interconnection between these goals. So we've started to report from the perspective that basically in the Netherlands, we're working on 6 major transitions, green and just transitions. We've given them a name, but you can shift. But the point is to each of these transitions includes both green, both justice and both social goals, because you cannot see them apart from each other. In the report, some of the conclusions we took over the past 2 years is that, yes, there's a lot of awareness, there's a lot of ambition in policies, but the challenge is to scale up and to scale up with speed in practice. And we've tried to analyze what are the issues, the obstacles that we run into. And I think it really helps to put these on the agenda, because you need to do that before you can move to the next step in order to find, to start experimenting solutions. So I do share your point of view that, or the conclusion that, yes, we have increasing clarity about the obstacles. And that gives us, I think, the stepping stone to also look towards the solutions. And increasingly you see that debate moving there. Some of the obstacles from our report to Parliament were, for example, still a struggle to make truly sustainable companies be able to compete with less sustainable companies. How do we address that? Another obstacle, can we actually have a frank discussion about the behavioral change needed? Another obstacle, how do you move from all these pilots with brilliant integrated partnerships of all stakeholders towards scaling them up into the new model? So a lot of these obstacles are already being put on the table. And I think, the next years we're going to flip them and experiment our way into the right solutions, I hope.
I'm not answering any of the specific questions, but I was listening to all of you, and I was listening yesterday to people saying that we are going to perhaps reach 2.7 degrees if we do what we have promised. The big problem I think we have had over the last 30 years is that when a new government comes, they don't implement the past policies. So I remember that Ed Nijpels had a policy in the Netherlands to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and it was strengthened by the next environment minister, Hans Alders, and then that disappeared from the agenda. In 2004, we didn't look back and see did we achieve our goals or not. So that's one problem. And then you see in America, Trump walks out of the agreement, and then the next government comes in, and maybe the next government walks out, and then we can see the Americans walking in and out. And so my problem is that even if you have a fantastic policy now, Sandra, in your document, what happens if the next government comes?
This one has been around for 3 governments in a row, so 4.
Then I'm really nervous about the quality of the... Earthly. There's a lot. So, you know, I think there's a lot of hope, but when I hear governments saying we'll reach net zero in 2050 or 2060 or 2070, what really frightens me is that in 10 years there'll be a completely different government and they won't do what has been agreed to. So how can we hold our politicians to account? And I think that's so difficult. I don't know how to do that in a democracy.
I think this is a big question, great question, but I see many hands coming up. I had one here already in front, and Ingrid is chair of the conference, of course, got the floor. Maybe you can pick some questions from the back on the left side, so that just give the microphone who...
My name is Karin Bäckström. I'm at Stockholm University and LSE. Thanks for a great panel and dialogue. Really nice with both academics and practitioners. So I have 2 comments/questions, and I would like to hear from you, since you're different sectors. How do you navigate in this current landscape and situation and era where we have this enormous backlash in the context of the poly crisis and authoritarian populism and democratic backlash, as Frank referred to? How do you think public opinion can be changed in a world of this incremental change and backlash? Because I increasingly hear, both from politicians of the left and the right, that these transformational goals are out of touch with realities, given the cost of living crisis. And to take the liberty to take some example from Sweden, like Netherlands is a very small country, but strong traditionally on a green pioneer. It said already 2015 it was going to be the first fossil-free welfare state in the world, which actually addressed the distributional aspects of decarbonization. What happens now? In the foreign policy declaration, the SDGs and Agenda 2030 is not even mentioned, even if it's the midterm review. Secondly, the government admittedly say that emissions will increase, the 2030 and 45 goals will not be reached, foreign aid will be cut. I could go on, but let's stop there. So I wonder how you and your countries deal with this. It's a broad, I know it's a broad question. Secondly, the kind of elephant in the room here, now the discourse is very much on production, consumption, decarbonization of industry. But what about the consumption-based emissions? And here, and emissions relating to lifestyle, that transformation. And here I have another example. Sweden agreed, all parties, which was very positive, in 2022 to be the first country to have a goal on national consumption-based emissions. All parties actually agreed to this. Now it's basically, that was going to develop to a policy proposal. It's basically dead on the agenda. So I was wondering, how do you see the prospects for addressing not only the industrial production emissions, but the consumption side? Thank you again.
Thank you. Let's take a couple of questions more. There in the back, there are a couple of people. And can I ask you to be concise and a bit short in answering the questions, because we have about 15 minutes left, and I'd like to have some more questions for our panel.
My name is Michael Davis-Ven. I'm with the FU Free University here in Amsterdam. A comment and a brief question. This is the second SDG Summit discussion that I've been to recently. The first was recently at the German Parliament, at the Bundestag, where I was a panelist. And it didn't take long before the discussions were focused on what's happening in one European country or another. And there I had to point out the fact that SDGs, the move towards sustainability, has to be coordinated worldwide, because it wouldn't make sense for one region or one country to achieve sustainability while the rest of the world hasn't done that. My question then now, which is not related to the comment, is a question about the idea behind SDGs. I mean, we have selected 15 years to transition the entire world, every single country, and it took about 60 plus years, the industrial revolution that contributed so significantly to making the world unsustainable. Does it make sense that 15 years is all there is that was decided on?
Thank you. The gentleman over there.
Thank you. Marcelo Olivares from Universidad Católica del Norte in Chile. My question relates to, at the beginning, it was mentioned that we need to move from what's going wrong to who benefits and power. So my question is, what role do rich countries have in shaping these power relationships within global south countries, when those power imbalances are the results of trade with the global north?
Thank you. I'm going to help the people with the mic.
I'll be brief. So the question is, what's the theory of change behind this whole SDG circus? So, I mean, it is self-referential, right? We academics contribute to all these indicators, and preferably with a heavy dominance of the natural sciences, like Yohita just explained how difficult it is. Then Jeffrey Sachs says, apparently just recently, that he just come aware of this whole issue, where Yohita wrote a paper on that 1 degree target as being a just target decades ago. So what is this sort of a policy optimism that is like a neurosis, that you all say, well, we need big social transformations, but they can't be achieved within that narrow corridor that is acceptable. The system can't stomach these sort of transformations. So there is a discrepancy, and who's going to speak out on that discrepancy between what the system can stomach and the real needs that are out there?
Yeah, indeed. Ingrid, you also had a question, and then we turn to the panel.
Yeah, thanks. So I'm going to contribute to making the puzzle more complex. Yohita's cake is alive. And the Earth is, for me, the Earth is not for us as humans to divide amongst ourselves, despite the really important discussions that we've been having, right? But the Earth is a stakeholder, or nature and non-humans are a stakeholder in this discussion as well. So the cake cannot be divided, and perhaps needs to be divided not only among humans, but also among non-humans, and some of it doesn't actually want to be divided among humans or non-humans. So how do we incorporate those interests into this discussion? And actually I have the solution as well, because I think if we change our mindset from this anthropocentric perspective to a more inclusive perspective, and if we're able to incorporate those values into our discussions, I think that's actually part of the answer.
Thank you.
I have to take that question.
Yes, we have about 10 minutes left, so the really big questions are on the table. So I think maybe that is also our contribution to the research agenda that Ingrid wants to get out of this conference. So I hope you take good notes of everything that's here to bring that big questions on that research agenda. You were eager, Yohita, to start off, and then we just go along the panelists and to respond.
So the cake actually takes in interspecies justice into account. So the size of the cake already has reserved land for nature, or reserved land for other, the more than human species or whatever. And that's part of the cake is actually taking care of that. So after that, how do we share between us? And in our surface water boundary, for example, we really give so much more to nature than to humans that I think that's going to be a really big problem between interspecies justice and intergenerational justice. So those are challenges, but our cake already has accounted for interspecies justice. So I don't think that the only thing that you can ask is, have we taken all the different aspects into account? But we have started with that. And I'll leave the others to answer the other questions. There was no time.
Good. Okay. Great questions again. I mean, I think one conclusion for me is also, and this I think is very important, drives in this community, that one thing is we have to change the way how science operates and how academia operates. I think it's not only that we need to have more papers, we need to have more solutions. I think it's very important that the scientific communities becomes much more active in this. We had a fantastic panel earlier about scientists from our communities who have worked on political solutions and also have actively pushed them forwards. For example, the Non-Proliferation Treaty on Fossil Fuels that came out of the scientific community was then pushed forward, became a mainstream position of many NGOs, and has maybe also some political impact. I think we have to much more engage in this, not only publishing papers, not only moving forward, but trying to develop short-term feasible solutions that can change things, and then also putting them forward as a scientific community. I think that is very, very important. But then for the SDGs also, I think also maybe it's not fully the answer to Martin's question, but it's one point that I think is very important, are the unintended negative consequences of SDGs as well. It's not only the theory of change, it's also the harm that could be done by SDGs because they are there, they are legitimizing maybe inaction because governments are asked by citizens to take solutions, and then the solution is we have the SDGs, and that can demobilize. A lot of critical agendas, critical movements can be demobilized because they believe, hey, I've seen the SDG flag in the city of Utrecht, it's very beautiful, governments have taken actions, there's an SDG ambassador, so there's a lot of actions being taken, demobilization, legitimacy of inaction, and maybe also advancement of solutions that are not necessarily sustainable. Because the SDGs, as we discussed also in one panel, include, for example, also economic growth as one of the SDGs, and make them very... and inclusive economic growth. Good, okay. But the number, but it is growth as being mentioned in a sense. There's also for all those in SDG 8.1.
Mostly for developing countries with an additional goal saying that developed countries need to decouple economic growth from pressure on the environment.
Good. I mean, there's long debate on that.
Read the goals carefully. There's
I did. Good. Okay. I mean, there's a difficult discussion about decoupling and degrowth. Anyway, but that's kind of we had a previous discussion here in the opening planning. So I think I kind of disagree. Anyway, but I think this is a very important factor also to consider. Not only the positive impacts of SDGs, the positive part, but also the negative part, the potential demobilizing and legitimizing part of the SDGs that can be also quite negative for social movements and activists and finding the political solutions. On that happy note.
Yeah, of course. This is why they put us together in a panel, because we always have interesting debates. I hear that very often, you know, the SDGs are, you know, not a good idea because they allow greenwashing. I always say, listen, we're not saying that we have to get rid of the international human rights framework because some parties might not adhere to him or abuse them. I think the SDGs are very strong. It's the highest level of ambition that globally we've managed to achieve with all 193 member states of the United Nations, supported by so many different sectors and parties. Globally, it's a really good, complete standard of what we know that we need to do. Yes, it's the what, it's not the how. I mean, it is, after all, you know, a global agreement. If you want to negotiate the how, you take away the autonomy also of governments to make their own decisions politically about how. But if you do support the SDGs, it's clear that, you know, the how cannot be light and a little bit. It has to be very thorough. It has to be interconnected. It has to be all in. And then I think we recognize that, you know, we are still trying to figure out what the right solutions are. But I mean, waiting until we have the perfect theory of change, like Danielle said, is not going to help us achieve it. 15 years, will we make it? I think it's good to have an ambitious target also in the time. To be honest, I do think, we're not going to be done in 2030. I mean, you will have to continue doing this after. If I may, just one reaction to the question about popular politics. This is all politicians that need to answer it, but from a civil service perspective, I think what we can contribute is to show that our policies are getting better and better at addressing all these different elements. And in the Netherlands, I'm very proud that this year we adopted a so-called policy compass, which includes the SDGs and the thinking around the well-being economy as a basis to assess our policies, our policy ideas before and while they are being developed against all these SDG goals. What are the effects of different goals on each other? Can you look for synergies? Can you avoid trade-offs? But also, what are the distributional effects, both in the here and now, so in the Netherlands at present time, but also assessed against our effects on other countries and the effects of our decisions now on future generations. This is all in our policy compass. If we and when we manage to really start applying that to all our policies, I really think we can start to show that we can design policies that are there for all people, and hopefully that will be one way to address the issues that you mentioned.
Thank you. I'm going to try to first answer your question as an upcoming politician. So, if I'm allowed. So I think it's a trap we're falling and allowing ourselves to step into if we follow the reasoning that the cost of living debate is a reason not to work on climate change, sustainability, or whatever. There are so many things that we could do that are both good for our fossil fuel footprint, for our health, as for the cost of living. For example, isolating homes. But if we follow the reasoning, we're giving it away, and we know that things can be done differently, but other interests will suffer. And I think we have to call that out and not go with the polarization narrative that we seem to accept too easily. So I ask ourselves not to obey in advance. There is no truth in what's being said. So I really would like to challenge ourselves a bit along the lines that Sandra says. There are so many things that we can do that are both socially and sustainably feasible. Only the interests behind the changes that we need for that are very, very strong. And that's what needs to be talked about. Who has an interest in calling this a polarized agenda? It's not us. And that needs to be brought from science to politics, to government, but also, so be clear about what you see happening and be clear about the solutions that are truly out there and that we know would work. And don't accept yes, but too easily. So that's one. The second one is about from Chile. I really love your question because I always start my presentations with the 1972 intervention of Salvador Allende in the United Nations that already said then very clearly in 3 minutes the devastating impact of multinationals globally, and multinationals, of course, mostly, he said it very clearly, mostly in the industrialized world or in the developed world, and he already predicted that we would suffer those consequences ourselves if we wouldn't work on that. So yes, there is a very big responsibility of the Western world in the way power is distributed in developing countries. We also now see the impacts in developed countries. You said a bit about the falling apart of the social contract. And I think that is what we need to debate much more here. And then I'll just jump to your question. Of course, the SDGs are not the Holy Grail, but we can use them in many ways that put this debate on the agenda. This debate isn't on the agenda in the Netherlands. I'm so sorry. Nobody is talking about the role of the Netherlands in the global economy at this point. We're making ourselves too small. And the spillover index, which is the opposite of the SDG goal, so it says how you contribute to not achieving the SDGs, the Netherlands is one of the lowest, the worst countries on that index. So you can use the SDGs as you can use the Climate Change Convention if you want to divest, etc., etc. Don't pretend it's the Holy Grail, but also don't throw it away as if it were inexistent and insignificant, but use it wisely. as any other framework we have to use.
Thank you very much. I would have liked to give you the last word, but just a few elements. Well, one point that is really important along the same line is that SDGs are really very important in the North-South discussion. When Europe is discussing the Green Deal as an opportunity for Africa, Africa answers, my polar star is not climate, it's SDGs. And that normative legitimacy is extremely important, so we need that at least for that. What is not functioning is the HLPF. The idea that every year, and then every 4 years with a big summit, we would progress because of a kind of a peer pressure, that is not, I mean, who heard about the SDG Summit beyond us, who have looked at it? It's a pity, but in New York, that was really, nobody was caring about the SDG Summit except those who were in it, and civil society. I could not enter the room. There are lots of things that were very complicated. So it's not functioning as such, and I really concur with you that there are other arenas where the SDG needs to be put into be the organizing normative framework for transformation to be operated in other fora. Not that it's really functioning better at UNFCCC, but a little bit more political pressure is happening there. The last thing that I wanted to say is that along the lines that you were mentioning, and that's about what is the research agenda for, I mean, for Earth system governance, that's complicated. But I firmly believe at IDRI what we do is that we need to really ask the question, not just about just transition, but about the social contract. What is falling apart is the social contract. And if on top of that the cake is beginning to become smaller, it will be even more complicated. And one very important part of the social contract is how we exert political rights. Why is democracy failing in so many of our countries? And I think this is something where my advice to myself, my recommendations is how, as a think tank based in Paris, working on global issues, can I contribute to the fact that I need actually to support social movements at the basis, because that's where we can reconstruct democracy. So an example of what I mean by social movements, when there was these riots in Paris, or in France in general, some mothers said, we need to protect schools because they are our common goods. This is a concern that is from which we should start, because that's a basic need, and from there we could try and see how that relates to SDGs. But we need to really support those. And as researchers, it's also our duty, but I don't know, we don't have armies of researchers to work with all these social movements locally, but I believe that's something that we need to explore.
Thanks very much. Unfortunately, we run out of time. I feel that there are so many more questions to be raised, and the discussion can continue, probably only just warming up. So. Unfortunately, this is the end of the session. Please join me in a big hand for our panelists.